Leaders of the established 1966 military coup, including Army officers Colonel E.K. Kotoka, Major A.A. Afrifa, Lieutenant General, retired J.A. Ankara, and Police Inspector General J.W.K. Harley, justified their takeover by charging that the CPP administration was abusive and corrupt. They were equally disturbed by Kwame Nkrumah's aggressive involvement in African politics, and by his belief that Ghanaian troops could be sent anywhere in Africa to fight so-called liberation wars, even though they never did so. Above all, they pointed to the absence of democratic practices in the nation, a situation they claimed had affected the morale of the armed forces. According to General Kotoka, the military coup of 1966 was a nationalist one because it liberated the nation from Nkrumah's dictatorship, a declaration that was supported by Alex Kwai-Sensaki, Nkrumah's former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Despite the vast political changes that were brought about by the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, many problems remained. For example, the underlying ethnic and regional divisions within the society had to be addressed. The apparent spirit of national unity that seemed to have developed during the Nkrumah years turned out to have resulted in part from his coercive powers, as well as from his charisma. As a consequence, successive new leaders faced the problem of forging disparate personal, ethnic, and sectional interests into a nation with shared identity and interests. The economic burdens, aggravated by what some described as past extravagance, crippled each future government's ability to foster the rapid development needed to satisfy even minimal popular demands for a better life. The fear of a resurgence of an overly strong central authority continued to dominate the constitutional agenda and to pervade the thinking of many educated, politically minded Ghanaians. Others, however, felt that a strong government was essential. A considerable portion of the population had become convinced that effective, honest government was incompatible with competitive political parties. Many Ghanaians remained committed to non-political leadership for the nation, even in the form of military rule. The problems of the Bija administration, the country's first elected government after Nkrumah's fall, illustrated the problems Ghana would continue to face. The leaders of the coup that overthrew Nkrumah immediately opened the country's borders and its prison gates to allow the return from exile or release from preventive detention of all opponents of Nkrumah. The National Liberation Council, NLC, composed of 4 army officers and 4 police officers, assumed executive power. It appointed a cabinet of civil servants and promised to restore democratic government as quickly as possible. The ban on the formation of political parties remained in force until late 1968, but activity by individual figures began much earlier with the appointment of a succession of committees composed of civil servants and politicians as the first step in the return to civilian and representative rule. These moves culminated in the appointment of a representative assembly to draft a constitution for the Second Republic of Ghana. Political party activity was allowed to commence with the opening of the assembly. By election time in August 1969, the first competitive nationwide political contest since 1956, 5 parties had been organized. The assembly produced a document providing for a parliamentary republic with a president as head of state and a prime minister as head of government. Largely in response to Nkrumah's authoritarian excesses, the president's powers were greatly reduced, to a point almost entirely ceremonial. Real power rested with the prime minister and cabinet. The major contenders in the 1969 election were the Progress Party, PP, headed by Kofi A. Bija, and the National Alliance of Liberals, NAL, led by Kamla A. Bidima. Critics associated these two leading parties with the political divisions of the early Nkrumah years. The PP found much of its support among the old opponents of Nkrumah's CPP, the educated middle class and traditionalists of Ashanti region and the north. This link was strengthened by the fact that Bija had headed the NLM and its successor, the UP, before fleeing the country to oppose Nkrumah from exile. Similarly, the NAL was seen as the successor of the CPP's right wing, which Bidima had headed until he was ousted by Nkrumah in 1961. The elections demonstrated an interesting voting pattern. For example, the PP carried all the seats among the Asante and the Brong. All seats in the northern regions of the country were closely contested. In the Volta region, the PP won some U seats, while the NAL won all seats in the non-U northern section. Overall, the PP gained 59% of the popular vote and 74% of the seats in the National Assembly. The PP's victories demonstrated some support among nearly all the ethnic groups. An estimated 60% of the electorate voted. Immediately after the elections, Bidima was barred from taking his seat in the National Assembly by a Supreme Court decision involving those CPP members who had been accused of financial crimes. Bidima retired permanently from active participation in politics. The NAL, left without a strong leader, controlled 30 seats. In October 1970, it absorbed the members of 3 other minor parties in the assembly to form the Justice Party, JP, under the leadership of Joseph Appiah. Their combined strength constituted what amounted to a southern bloc with a solid constituency among most of the U and the peoples of the coastal cities. Bija, the PP leader in both Parliament and the nation, became Prime Minister when the National Assembly met in September. An interim 3-member presidential commission, composed of Major Afrifa, Police Inspector General Harley of the NLC, and the Chief of the Defense Staff, Major General A.K. Okran, served in place of an elected president for the first year and a half of civilian rule. The commission dissolved itself in August 1970. Before stepping down, Afrifa criticized the constitution, particularly provisions that served more as a bar to the rise of a dictator than as a blueprint for an effective, decisive government. The Electoral College chose as President Chief Justice Edward Akufo-Addo, one of the leading nationalist politicians of the UGCC era, and one of the judges dismissed by Nkrumah in 1964. All attention, however, remained focused on Prime Minister Bija and his government. Much was expected of the Bija administration, because its parliamentarians were considered intellectuals and, therefore, more perceptive in their evaluations of what needed to be done. Many Ghanaians hoped that their decisions would be in the general interest of the nation, as compared with those made by the Nkrumah administration, which were judged to satisfy narrow party interests and, more important, Nkrumah's personal agenda. The NLC had given assurances that there would be more democracy, more political maturity, and more freedom in Ghana, because the politicians allowed to run for the 1969 elections were proponents of Western democracy. In fact, these were the same individuals who had suffered under the old regime and were, therefore, thought to understand the benefits of democracy. Two early measures initiated by the Bija government were the expulsion of large numbers of non-citizens from the country, and a companion measure to limit foreign involvement in small businesses. The moves were aimed at relieving the unemployment created by the country's precarious economic situation. The policies were popular because they forced out of the retail sector of the economy those foreigners, especially Lebanese, Asians, and Nigerians, who were perceived as unfairly monopolizing trade to the disadvantage of Ghanaians. Many other Bija moves, however, were not popular. Bush's decision to introduce a loan program for university students, who had hitherto received free education, was challenged because it was interpreted as introducing a class system into the country's highest institutions of learning. Some observers even saw Bush's devaluation of the national currency and his encouragement of foreign investment in the industrial sector of the economy as conservative ideas that could undermine Ghana's sovereignty. The opposition Justice Party's basic policies did not differ significantly from those of the Bija administration. Still, the party attempted to stress the importance of the central government rather than that of limited private enterprise in economic development, and it continued to emphasize programs of primary interest to the urban workforce. The ruling PP emphasized the need for development in rural areas, both to slow the movement of population to the cities and to redress regional imbalance in levels of development. The JP and a growing number of PP members favored suspension of payment on some foreign debts of the Nkrumah era. This attitude grew more popular as debt payments became more difficult to meet. Both parties favored creation of a West African economic community, or an economic union with the neighboring West African states. Despite broad popular support garnered at its inception and strong foreign connections, the Bija government fell victim to an army coup within 27 months. Neither ethnic nor class differences played a role in the overthrow of the PP government. The crucial causes were the country's continuing economic difficulties, both those stemming from the high foreign debts incurred by Nkrumah and those resulting from internal problems. The PP government had inherited $580 million in medium and long-term debts, an amount equal to 25% of the gross domestic product of 1969. By 1971, the $580 million had been further inflated by $72 million in accrued interest payments and $296 million in short-term commercial credits. Within the country, an even larger internal debt fueled inflation. Ghana's economy remained largely dependent upon the often difficult cultivation of and market for cocoa. Cocoa prices had always been volatile, but exports of this tropical crop normally provided about half of the country's foreign currency earnings. Beginning in the 1960s, however, a number of factors combined to limit severely this vital source of national income. These factors included foreign competition, particularly from neighboring Côte d'Ivoire, a lack of understanding of free market forces by the government in setting prices paid to farmers, accusations of bureaucratic incompetence in the Cocoa Marketing Board, and the smuggling of crops into Côte d'Ivoire. As a result, Ghana's income from cocoa exports continued to fall dramatically. Austerity measures imposed by the Bija administration alienated influential farmers, who until then had been PP supporters. These measures were part of Bush's economic structural adjustment efforts to put the country on a sounder financial base. The austerity programs had been recommended by the International Monetary Fund. The recovery measures also severely affected the middle class and the salaried workforce, both of which faced wage freezes, tax increases, currency devaluations, and rising import prices. These measures precipitated protests from the Trade Union Congress. In response, the government sent the army to occupy the trade union headquarters and to block strike actions, a situation that some perceived as negating the government's claim to be operating democratically. The army troops and officers upon whom Bija relied for support were themselves affected, both in their personal lives and in the tightening of the defense budget, by these same austerity measures. As the leader of the anti-Bija coup declared on January 13, 1972, even those amenities enjoyed by the army during the Nkrumah regime were no longer available. Knowing that austerity had alienated the officers, the Bija government began to change the leadership of the army's combat elements. This, however, was the last straw. Lieutenant Colonel Ignatius Kutu Acheampong, temporarily commanding the 1st Brigade around Accra, led a bloodless coup that ended the Second Republic. National Redemption Council years, 1972-79. Despite its short existence, the Second Republic was significant in that the development problems the nation faced came clearly into focus. These included uneven distribution of investment funds and favoritism towards certain groups and regions. Furthermore, important questions about developmental priorities emerged. For example, was rural development more important than the needs of the urban population? Or, to what extent was the government to incur the cost of university education? And more important, was the public to be drawn into the debate about the nation's future? The impact of the fall of Ghana's Second Republic cast a shadow across the nation's political future because no clear answers to these problems emerged. According to one writer, the overthrow of the PP government revealed that Ghana was no longer the pace-setter in Africa's search for workable political institutions. Both the radical left and the conservative right had failed. In opposing Nkrumah's one-party state, Bija allegedly argued that socialist rule in Ghana had led to unemployment and poverty for many while party officials grew richer at the expense of the masses. But in justifying the one-party state, Nkrumah pointed to the weaknesses of multi-party parliamentary democracy, a system that delayed decision-making processes and, therefore, the ability to take action to foster development. The fall of both the Nkrumah and the Bija regimes seemed to have confused many with regard to the political direction the nation needed to take. In other words, in the first few years after the Nkrumah administration, Ghanaians were unable to arrive at a consensus on the type of government suited to address their national problems. It was this situation, the inability of the PP government to satisfy diverse interest groups, that ostensibly gave Acheampong an excuse for the January 13 takeover. Acheampong's National Redemption Council, NRC, claimed that it had to act to remove the ill effects of the currency devaluation of the previous government and thereby, at least in the short run, to improve living conditions for individual Ghanaians. Under the circumstances, the NRC was compelled to take immediate measures. Although committed to the reversal of the fiscal policies of the PP government, the NRC, by comparison, adopted policies that appeared painless and, therefore, popular. But unlike the coup leaders of the NLC, members of the NRC did not outline any plan for the return of the nation to democratic rule. Some observers accused the NRC of acting simply to rectify their own grievances. To justify their takeover, coup leaders leveled charges of corruption against Bija and his ministers. In its first years, the NRC drew support from a public pleased by the reversal of Bush's austerity measures. The Ghanaian currency was revalued upward, and two moves were announced to lessen the burden of existing foreign debts: the repudiation of $90 million of Nkrumah's debts to British companies, and the unilateral rescheduling of the rest of the country's debts for payment over 50 years. Later, the NRC nationalized all large foreign-owned companies. But these measures, while instantly popular in the streets, did nothing to solve the country's real problems. If anything, they aggravated the problem of capital flow. Unlike the NLC of 1966, the NRC sought to create a truly military government. Hence, in October 1975, the ruling council was reorganized into the Supreme Military Council, SMC, and its membership was restricted to a few senior military officers. The intent was to consolidate the military's hold over government administration and to address occasional disagreements, conflicts, and suspicions within the armed forces, which by now had emerged as the constituency of the military government. Little input from the civilian sector was allowed, and no offers were made to return any part of the government to civilian control during the SMC's first 5 years in power. SMC members believed that the country's problems were caused by a lack of organization, which could be remedied by applying military organization and thinking. This was the extent of the SMC philosophy. Officers were put in charge of all ministries and state enterprises. Junior officers and sergeants were assigned leadership roles down to the local level in every government department and parastatal organization. During the NRC's early years, these administrative changes led many Ghanaians to hope that the soldiers in command would improve the efficiency of the country's bloated bureaucracies. Acheampong's popularity continued into 1974, as the government successfully negotiated international loan agreements and rescheduled Ghana's debts. The government also provided price supports for basic food imports, while seeking to encourage Ghanaians to become self-reliant in agriculture and the production of raw materials. In the Operation Feed Yourself program, all Ghanaians were encouraged to undertake some form of food production, with the goal of eventual food self-sufficiency for the country. The program enjoyed some initial success, but support for it gradually waned. Whatever limited success the NRC had in these efforts, however, was overridden by other basic economic factors. Industry and transportation suffered greatly as world oil prices rose during and after 1974, and the lack of foreign exchange and credit left the country without fuel. Basic food production continued to decline even as the population grew, largely because of poor price management and urbanization. When world cocoa prices rose again in the late 1970s, Ghana was unable to take advantage of the price rise because of the low productivity of its old orchards. Moreover, because of the low prices paid to cocoa farmers, some growers along the nation's borders smuggled their produce to Togo or Côte d'Ivoire. Disillusionment with the government grew, particularly among the educated. Accusations of personal corruption among the rulers also began to surface. The reorganization of the NRC into the SMC, Supreme Military Council, in 1975 may have been part of a face-saving attempt. Shortly after that time, the government sought to stifle opposition by issuing a decree forbidding the propagation of rumors and by banning a number of independent newspapers and detaining their journalists. Also, armed soldiers broke up student demonstrations, and the government repeatedly closed the universities, which had become important centers of opposition to NRC policies. Despite these efforts, the SMC by 1977 found itself constrained by mounting nonviolent opposition. To be sure, discussions about the nation's political future and its relationship to the SMC had begun in earnest. Although the various opposition groups, university students, lawyers, and other organized civilian groups, called for a return to civilian constitutional rule at Chempong, and the SMC favored a union government, a mixture of elected civilian and appointed military leaders, but one in which party politics would be abolished. University students and many intellectuals criticized the union government idea, but others, such as Justice Gustav Korentengedau, who chaired the 17-member ad hoc committee appointed by the government to work out details of the plan, defended it as the solution to the nation's political problems. Supporters of the union government idea viewed multi-party political contests as the perpetrators of social tension and community conflict among classes, regions, and ethnic groups. Unionists argued that their plan had the potential to depoliticize public life and to allow the nation to concentrate its energies on economic problems. A national referendum was held in March 1978 to allow the people to accept or reject the union government concept. A rejection of the union government meant a continuation of military rule. Given this choice, it was surprising that so narrow a margin voted in favor of union government. Opponents of the idea organized demonstrations against the government, arguing that the referendum vote had not been free or fair. The Chempong government reacted by banning several organizations, and by jailing as many as 300 of its opponents. The agenda for change in the union government referendum called for the drafting of a new constitution by an SMC-appointed commission, the selection of a constituent assembly by November 1978, and general elections in June 1979. The ad hoc committee had recommended a non-party election, an elected executive president, and a cabinet whose members would be drawn from outside a single-house National Assembly. The military council would then step down, although its members could run for office as individuals. In July 1978, in a sudden move, the other SMC officers forced Chempong to resign, replacing him with Lieutenant General Frederick W.K. Akafo. The SMC apparently acted in response to continuing pressure to find a solution to the country's economic dilemma. Inflation was estimated to be as high as 300% that year. There were shortages of basic commodities, and cocoa production fell to half its 1964 peak. The council was also motivated by Chempong's failure to dampen rising political pressure for changes. Akafo, the new SMC chairman, promised publicly to hand over political power to a new government to be elected by July 1, 1979. Despite Akafo's assurances, opposition to the SMC persisted. Because Akafo implemented a number of austerity programs which intensified the food shortages and the toll on the people, the call for the formation of political parties intensified. In an effort to gain support in the face of continuing strikes over economic and political issues, the Akafo government at length announced that the formation of political parties would be allowed after January 1979. Akafo also granted amnesty to former members of both Nkrumah's CPP and Bush's PP, as well as to all those convicted of subversion under Chempong. The decree lifting the ban on party politics went into effect on January 1, 1979, as planned. The Constitutional Assembly that had been working on a new constitution presented an approved draft and adjourned in May. All appeared set for a new attempt at constitutional government in July, when a group of young Army officers overthrew the SMC government in June 1979. Flight Lieutenant Jerry John Rawlings grew discontented with Ignatius Kutu Chempong's government, which had come to power through a coup in January 1972. Chempong was accused not only of corruption, but also of maintaining Ghana's dependency on pre-colonial powers, in a situation which led to economic decline and impoverishment. Rawlings was part of the Free Africa movement, an underground movement of military officers who wanted to unify Africa through a series of coups. On May 15, 1979, 5 weeks prior to civilian elections, Rawlings and 6 other soldiers staged a coup against the government of General Fred Akafo, but failed and were arrested by the military. Rawlings was publicly sentenced to death in a general court-martial and imprisoned, although his statements on the social injustices that motivated his actions won him civilian sympathy. While awaiting execution, Rawlings was sprung from custody on June 4, 1979 by a group of soldiers. Claiming that the government was corrupt beyond redemption, and that new leadership was required for Ghana's development, he led the group in a coup to oust the Akafo government and Supreme Military Council. Shortly afterwards, Rawlings established and became the chairman of a 15-member Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, AFRC, primarily composed of junior officers. He and the AFRC ruled for 112 days and arranged the execution by firing squad of 8 military officers, including Generals Kodiai, Joy Amadum, Roger Feli, and Ituka, as well as the 3 former Ghanaian heads of state, Chempong, Akafo, and Akwasi Afrifa. These executions were dramatic events in the history of Ghana, which had previously suffered few instances of political violence. Rawlings later implemented a much wider house-cleaning exercise involving the killings and abduction of over 300 Ghanaians. Elections were held on time shortly after the coup. On September 24, 1979, power was peacefully handed over by Rawlings to President Hilla Limann, whose People's National Party, PNP, had the support of Nkrumah's followers. 2 years later, on December 31, 1981, Rawlings ousted President Hilla Limann in a coup d'état, claiming that civilian rule was weak and the country's economy was deteriorating. The killings of the Supreme Court justices, Cecilia Corentingadao, Frederick Sarkodie, and Kwadwo Ajayi-Ajipong, military officers Major Sam Akwa and Major Dosana Nantagma also occurred during the second military rule of Rawlings. However, unlike the 1979 executions, these persons were abducted and killed in secret, and it is unclear who was behind their murders, though Joachim Amartey Ikwe and 4 others were convicted of murdering the justices and Akwa, and were executed in 1982. Believing the Limann regime to be unable to resolve Ghana's neo-colonial economic dependency, Rawlings led a second coup against Limann and indicted the entire political class on December 31, 1981. In place of Limann's People's National Party, Rawlings established the Provisional National Defense Council, PNDC, military junta as the official government. Rawlings hosted state visits from revolutionaries from other countries, including Desi Bouterse, Suriname, Daniel Ortega, Nicaragua, and Sam Nujoma, Namibia. 22 More famously, Rawlings reversed Limann's boycott of Gadafist Libya, allowing the Black Stars to compete in the 1982 African Cup of Nations. The team won the AFCON trophy for the 4th time, their last win as of 2022. Although the PNDC claimed to be representative of the people, it lacked experience in the creation and implementation of clear economic policies. Rawlings, like many of his predecessors, attributed current economic and social problems to the trade malpractices and other antisocial activities of a few businesspeople. In December 1982, the PNDC announced its 4-year economic program of establishing a state monopoly on export-import trade with the goal of eliminating corruption surrounding import licenses and shift trade away from dependency on Western markets. Unrealistic price controls were imposed on the market and enforced through coercive acts, especially against businesspeople. This resolve to employ state control over the economy is best demonstrated by the destruction of the Makola No. 1 market. The PNDC established Workers' Defense Committees, WDCs, and People's Defense Committees, PDCs, to mobilize the population to support radical changes to the economy. Price controls on the sale of food were beneficial to urban workers, but placed undue burden on 70% of the rural population whose income largely depended on the prices of agricultural products. Rawlings' economic policies led to an economic crisis in 1983, forcing him to undertake structural adjustment and submit himself to election to retain power. Elections were held in January 1992, leading Ghana back to multi-party democracy. Rawlings established the National Commission on Democracy, NCD, shortly after the 1982 coup, and employed it to survey civilian opinion and make recommendations that would facilitate the process of democratic transition. In March 1991, the NCD released a report recommending the election of an executive president, the establishment of a national assembly, and the creation of the post of prime minister. The PNDC used NCD recommendations to establish a committee for the drafting of a new constitution based on past Ghanaian constitutions, that lifted the ban on political parties in May 1992 after it was approved by referendum. On November 3, 1992, election results compiled by the INEC from 200 constituencies showed that Rawlings' NDC had won 60% of the votes, and had obtained the majority needed to prevent a second round of voting. More specifically, the NDC won 62% in the Brong-Ahafo region, 93% in the Volta region, and majority votes in Upper West, Upper East, Western, Northern, Central, and Greater Accra regions. His opponents Professor Adu Boahen won 31% of the votes, former President Hilla Limann won 6.8%, Kwabena Darko won 2.9%, and Emmanuel Erskine won 1.7%. Voter turnout was 50%. The ability of opposition parties to compete was limited by the vast advantages Rawlings possessed. Rawlings' victory was aided by the various party structures that were integrated into society during his rule, called the organs of the revolution. These structures included the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, CDRs, Commando Units, December 31st Women's Organization, the June 4th Movement, People's Militias, and Mob Squads, and operated on a system of popular control through intimidation. Rawlings held a monopoly over national media, and was able to censor print and electronic media through a PNDC newspaper licensing decree, PNDC Law 221. Moreover, Rawlings imposed a 20,000 cedis, about $400, cap on campaign contributions, which made national publicity of opposition parties virtually impossible. Rawlings himself began campaigning before the official unbanning of political parties, and had access to state resources, and was able to effectively meet all monetary demands required of a successful campaign. Rawlings traveled across the country, initiating public works projects, and giving public employees a 60% pay rise prior to election day. Opposition parties objected to the election results, citing incidences of vote stuffing in regions where Rawlings was likely to lose in rural areas with scant populations, as well as a bloated voters' register and a partisan electoral commission. However, the Commonwealth Observer Group, led by Sir Ellis Clarke, approved of the election as free and fair, as there were very few issues at polling stations and no major incidences of voter coercion. In contrast, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, issued a report supporting claims that erroneous entries in voter registration could have affected election results. The Carter Center did acknowledge minor electoral issues, but did not see these problems as indicative of systematic electoral fraud. Opposition parties boycotted subsequent Ghana parliamentary and presidential elections, and the unicameral National Assembly, of which NDC officials won 189 of 200 seats and essentially established a one-party parliament that lacked legitimacy and only had limited legislative powers. After the disputed election, the PNDC was transformed into the National Democratic Congress (NDC). Rawlings took office on January 7, 1993, the same day that the new constitution came into effect, and the government became known as the Fourth Republic of Ghana.